My sister left 3 kids on my porch and told me it would be 1 hour. That was 12 years ago. I want you to sit with that number for a second. 12 years. Not one afternoon. Not one weekend while she figured things out. 12 years of birthdays or nights, school shoes, fevers that wouldn't break, a boy who needed stitches on his chin, a girl who cried the first time she got her period because she didn't understand what was happening to her body, and there was no mother to explain it to her. I did that. Alone. On a teacher's salary, in a house I bought with money I didn't have to spare, because 3 children needed a bedroom and a yard and a life that didn't feel like an emergency. I want you to picture it clearly, because I've had to picture it 1,000 times since this all started. A woman in her late 20s, standing on her own front porch, holding a toddler she'd never met before that morning, while 2 older children stood behind their mother's legs, watching her walk away without turning around. That's the actual image, not a metaphor, not a dramatic flourish for a video. That's what happened on my porch on a Tuesday morning in March 12 years ago. And last month, that same woman, my sister, walked into a courtroom, looked me in the eye like I was a stranger who'd stolen something from her, and told a judge that the house was rightfully hers, that she never actually abandoned her children, that I had, in her words, manipulated a temporary arrangement into a permanent theft. I sat 2 feet away from her while she said that. I watched her face while the words came out, and I want you to understand something. She believed it, or she'd convinced herself well enough to say it out loud, under oath, in front of a judge, without her voice shaking. That's the part that still unsettles me more than anything else in this whole ordeal. Not the lawsuit itself, the performance of certainty. I want to tell you exactly what happened. Not the version she's telling people at church, not the version she's put in a legal filing written by a lawyer she can barely afford. The real one, start to finish. Because by the end of this, you're going to understand exactly why I stood in that courtroom and didn't flinch, and exactly why the judge's ruling, when it finally came, felt less like a victory and more like the simple restoration of something that should never have been in question. My name is Claire. I'm 39 years old now. I teach 4th grade in the same district I've taught in for 15 years, and I raised 3 children who are not, biologically, mine to raise. This is what my sister did, and what it cost her, not in dollars, though we'll get to that, but in something much harder to ever get back. To understand how someone leaves their children on a porch and disappears for over a decade, you have to understand who she was before that morning, because people don't wake up one day and become capable of that. It builds. Renee is 4 years younger than me. Growing up, she was the golden one, the pretty one, the funny one, the one who could talk her way out of anything, and usually did. I was the responsible one, which in our family meant I was the background. Nobody worries about the responsible one. Nobody checks in. You just get handed things, literally, figuratively, and you're expected to hold them without complaint. When our mother got sick when I was 19, I was the one who moved home to help. Renee was 22 states away pursuing an acting career that never quite happened, and when it didn't happen, she found a boyfriend who told her she was too talented for the life she was living, and then another boyfriend who said the same thing, and then a husband who said it loudest of all. I don't say this to be cruel about her younger years, because I understand in retrospect that some of it wasn't entirely her fault. Our mother had a habit of praising Renee's potential in a way that never left room for ordinary effort. Renee was always going to be discovered, always one audition away from the life she deserved. And when that didn't happen by her late 20s, I think something in her genuinely broke. She'd tell me, during rare phone calls in those years, about auditions that almost went somewhere, about industry people who'd promised things that never materialized, about how unfair it was that people less talented than her kept getting opportunities she didn't. I listened mostly, because that's what a sister does. Though even then, I noticed how rarely she asked about my life in return, about caring for our mother, about the classes I'd put on hold, about anything happening 2,000 miles away from wherever she currently was. By the time she met Danny, she was 26, tired of the industry that hadn't worked out, and I think, looking back, genuinely relieved to have someone else make decisions for a while. Danny offered her a version of stability that had nothing to do with her own effort or talent. Just marry him, and the deciding would be done for her from then on. I remember thinking, at their wedding, that she looked more relaxed than I'd seen her in years, and mistaking that relaxation for happiness rather than what it may have actually been. The particular relief of handing your life over to someone else entirely. That husband was Danny. Danny had a temper he blamed on other people, and a habit of vanishing for days at a time that he called clearing his head. I met him exactly 4 times before their wedding, and every single time, something small and wrong sat in the back of my throat that I couldn't quite name at the time. He had a way of answering questions directed at Renee before she could open her mouth. He had a way of laughing at things that weren't funny, loudly, so that the room had to notice him. I told my mother once gently that I wasn't sure about him. My mother told me it wasn't my place. She was probably right, in the sense that it wasn't, and probably wrong, in the sense that somebody should have said something more than once. Renee had 3 kids with him in 5 years. Mason, then Ava, then baby Theo, and every single time I saw her during those years, she looked more tired, more far away, like she was disappearing in slow motion even before she actually left. I'd visit for a weekend here and there, and I'd notice the same things over and over. The way she flinched slightly when Danny raised his voice at the television. The way she'd apologize for things that weren't her fault. A spilled glass of juice, a fussy baby, a dinner that came out 10 minutes later than planned. The way Mason, even as a small child, had learned to read the room before anyone else did, quietly moving his younger siblings toward a different part of the house whenever Danny's mood started to shift. I don't say any of this to excuse what came next. Whatever happened in that marriage, whatever Danny did or didn't do, none of it obligates a mother to leave her children on someone else's porch for over a decade. But I think it's important context, because people sometimes hear this story and assume Renee simply woke up one day and decided, out of nowhere, to abandon her kids. That's not quite accurate. What actually happened was years in the making, a slow erosion of a person who had already, in a lot of ways, been disappearing long before that Tuesday morning. I want to be honest with you. I saw it coming. Not the specifics. Nobody could have predicted the specifics. But I saw the shape of it. The way she'd call me at 2 a.m. to talk about nothing, really, just to hear a voice that wasn't Danny's. The way she'd say things like, "Sometimes I think everyone would be better off," and then laugh like it was a joke. I told her more than once, if you ever need help, call me first. Not last. First. She called me on a Tuesday morning in March, 12 years ago. She said Danny had left again, this time with the car and most of the money in their joint account, and she needed to handle some things, and could I watch the kids for an hour? 1 hour. I said of course. I had no idea I was agreeing to raise 3 children. I remember thinking, as her car pulled out of my driveway, that she'd forgotten to pack a bag for any of them. No diapers for Theo beyond the 2 in his backpack. No change of clothes for Ava. Mason had brought 1 book, a well-worn picture book about dinosaurs, tucked under his arm, like it was the only thing in the world he was sure he'd still have by the end of the day. Looking back, I think some part of him already knew. 7-year-olds understand more than we give them credit for. I think he packed that book because some instinct told him this wasn't going to be the kind of hour his mother said it would be. I didn't think about any of that at the time. At the time, I just made grilled cheese, because it was lunchtime, and I told myself she'd probably be back before the cartoon even finished. I remember what Mason was wearing. A dinosaur t-shirt, 1 shoe untied. He was 7. Ava was 4, clutching a stuffed rabbit missing 1 ear. Theo was 18 months old, barely walking, and Renee carried him on her hip up my porch steps, like she was in a hurry to somewhere more important than the conversation we were having. She looked terrible. Not sad terrible. Something closer to relieved, which at the time I mistook for exhaustion. 1 hour, she said again. Maybe 2. I have to go sort some things out with the bank, and I can't do it with 3 kids hanging off me. I said okay. I said take your time. I made the kids grilled cheese because it was lunchtime, and Mason said he was hungry, and I put on a cartoon, and I waited. 2 hours passed. Then 4. By 6 that evening, I called her phone, and it went straight to voicemail. By 9, I called Danny's mother, who I barely knew, and she said she hadn't heard from either of them, and honestly wasn't surprised, which told me more about that marriage than anything Renee had ever said out loud. I put 3 children to bed in a house with 1 bedroom that night. Mason on the couch, Ava in my bed with me, Theo in a laundry basket lined with blankets, because I did not own a crib. I remember lying awake for hours listening to Theo's breathing, terrified that the laundry basket wasn't safe enough somehow, terrified that I'd get a call in the morning telling me Renee had been in an accident, terrified in equal measure that she hadn't been in an accident at all and had simply chosen to disappear. Both possibilities felt unbearable in different ways. I called every relative I could think of that first night, an aunt in another state, a cousin Renee used to be close with, even a former coworker of hers, whose number I found in an old address book. Nobody had heard from her. Nobody seemed particularly shocked by that fact either, which told me something about how long this had been building that I hadn't wanted to see. Mason woke up around 2 in the morning that first night, and I found him sitting up on the couch in the dark, not crying, just staring at the front door like he expected it to open. I sat down next to him and asked if he wanted to talk. He shook his head. Then, after a long silence, he asked if he could keep his shoes by the door, in case they had to leave quickly. I told him nobody was making him leave, that he was safe, that he could stay as long as he needed to. He nodded, but he kept his shoes by the door anyway, for months after that, long after it should have been clear that nobody was coming to take him anywhere. She didn't call for 6 days. I went to work each of those mornings on almost no sleep, dropping Mason and Ava at their respective schools with forged permission slips I wasn't legally entitled to sign, carrying Theo to a daycare I found through a coworker's recommendation and paid for with money I genuinely could not spare that week. I remember standing in a school office on day 4, trying to explain to a confused administrator why I, not a parent, was picking up 2 children who weren't mine, and watching her expression shift slowly from suspicion to something closer to pity as I explained, haltingly, that I didn't fully know where their mother was either. When she finally did call, on the evening of the 6th day, she was crying, and she said she couldn't do it anymore. Not the marriage, not the kids, not any of it. And she needed time, just time, and could I keep them a little longer while she figured out where she was going to live and what she was going to do. I asked her directly where she'd been for 6 days. She said she'd been staying with a friend, a phrase she said quickly, almost defensively, that I didn't push on further at the time because I was too relieved simply to hear her voice and know she was alive. I said yes. Because what was the alternative? Foster care? These were my sister's children, my blood. I said yes, and I told myself it was temporary, and somewhere in the back of my mind, I think I already knew it wasn't. The first year nearly broke me, and I say that as someone who does not use that word lightly. I was 28 years old, single, teaching 4th grade, living in a 2-bedroom rental that I converted into a 3-kid household through sheer stubbornness and a lot of secondhand furniture. I learned to do hair I had no idea how to do, watching video tutorials at midnight so I could attempt a passable braid on Ava before school the next morning. I learned that Theo was allergic to strawberries the hard way, in an emergency room at 11 at night, my heart in my throat the entire drive, white-knuckling the steering wheel while a 4-year-old wheezed in the back seat. I learned Ava's nightmares came in a predictable pattern, worse on Sundays, for reasons I never fully understood, but suspected had to do with the anticipation of a new school week without a mother to walk her in. I also learned, that first year, exactly how much of my own life I was quietly setting down without ever formally deciding to. I'd been seeing someone before Renee left her kids on my porch. Nothing serious, but something with potential. And within 3 months, he'd stopped calling as often. Uncomfortable, I think, with the sudden reality of a girlfriend who came with 3 children attached. I didn't blame him then, and I don't particularly blame him now. Not everyone signs up for that, and he never actually signed up for it at all. But I remember the specific loneliness of that realization. Not just losing a relationship, but understanding clearly that an entire category of my life had just quietly closed itself off, indefinitely, without my consent. Mason was the hardest and the easiest, depending on the day. He understood, at 7, more than a child should have to understand. He asked me once, very matter-of-factly, whether his mom was ever coming back, and I told him the truth, which was that I didn't know, but that I wasn't going anywhere. He nodded, the way adults nod when they've decided not to argue with bad news, and went back to his homework. I remember standing in the kitchen doorway after that conversation for a long time, not moving, because something about a 7-year-old accepting abandonment with that much composure broke something in me that I hadn't expected to break. There were harder nights than that one. I remember a particular Thursday, maybe 4 months in, when all 3 of them were sick at once, some stomach virus that swept through in waves. And I was up until nearly 4 in the morning, rotating between rooms with a bucket, a thermometer, and a stack of towels, calling in sick to school for the first time in 3 years of teaching, because I simply could not physically show up anywhere else. I sat on the bathroom floor at one point, between cleaning up after Ava and checking Theo's temperature again, and I cried for probably 5 minutes straight, not because of the mess or the exhaustion exactly, but because nobody was coming to relieve me. There was no tag team parent. There was no grandmother arriving with soup. There was just me, and 3 sick children, and a decision I'd made without fully understanding what it would cost. I want to be clear that I don't regret that decision, not for 1 second, not even in the hardest moments. But I also think it's dishonest to tell this story as though it was simple, or as though love alone smoothed over the practical brutality of what raising 3 children alone, with no warning and no preparation, actually requires. It requires learning to function on almost no sleep. It requires figuring out, through trial and a lot of error, how to braid a 4-year-old's hair before school when you've never braided anything in your life. It requires becoming, almost overnight, a person entirely different from the one you were the week before. I filed for legal guardianship 8 months in, not because I wanted to erase Renee, but because I needed to be able to sign school forms and consent to medical care and enroll them in things without a lawyer telling me I had no standing. The moment that pushed me to finally file was Mason breaking his wrist on the playground, and a school nurse telling me, apologetically, that she legally couldn't release him to me for a hospital visit without a guardian's signature on file, because I wasn't his legal parent and had no documentation proving otherwise. I sat in that school office for 45 minutes on the phone with a family court clerk, a 7-year-old wincing in pain in the chair beside me, before we found a workaround for that single afternoon. I filed the paperwork the very next week. Renee signed the guardianship paperwork herself, from wherever she was living at the time. Nevada, I later found out, with a man she'd met 3 weeks after leaving her kids on my porch. The papers came back notarized within 10 days, no phone call attached, no note, nothing but a signature on a legal document that quietly transferred the entire weight of 3 children's lives onto mine. She signed it without an argument. I want you to remember that detail, because it becomes important later. She signed it willingly, no coercion, no hesitation. At the time, I read that as grief. Looking back, I think it was relief. She was free, and she knew it, and the paperwork was just a formality to make her freedom official. For the first 2 years, she called on birthdays. Those calls were always short, always a little strange. She'd ask Mason about school in vague, generic terms, ask Ava if she was being good, never quite land on a question specific enough to suggest she remembered the details of their actual lives. Theo was too young in those early calls to really participate, and I'd hold the phone up to him while he babbled at it, and I could hear, even then, a kind of distance in Renee's voice, like she was fulfilling an obligation rather than reaching for a connection. Then it became once or twice a year, usually around the holidays, usually shorter than the year before. Then, for a 4-year stretch, nothing at all. Not a card, not a call on Christmas, Nothing. I remember the exact moment I realized the silence had become permanent, or at least indefinite. It was Theo's 7th birthday, the age Mason had been the day she left, and I found myself standing in the kitchen holding a birthday cake, watching Theo blow out candles surrounded by school friends, and no biological parent in sight, and thinking, with a kind of flat, exhausted clarity, that Renee likely wasn't coming back in any meaningful sense. Not because something specific had happened, just because 4 years of silence has its own gravity, and by then, I think she'd built enough of a life elsewhere that reaching backward probably felt more disruptive than comforting, for her at least. I didn't tell the kids that I'd essentially given up expecting her. I never wanted them to feel like I'd closed a door that was theirs to close or keep open whenever they were old enough to decide that for themselves. But privately, by the time Theo turned 7, I had stopped waiting for a phone call that never came, and started simply living the life we actually had, instead of holding space for one that existed mostly in absence. I built an entire childhood out of the space she left behind. I want to talk about the house directly, because it's the center of everything that happened later, and I want you to understand exactly how I got it, because my sister's lawyer has since suggested I acquired it under suspicious circumstances, and I'd like to lay out the actual circumstances so you can judge for yourself. 3 kids in a 2-bedroom rental works for about a year before it stops working. By year 2, Mason needed his own space. Ava needed to stop sharing a room with a toddler who woke her up at 5 every morning, and I needed, frankly, somewhere to put myself that wasn't a converted closet. I started saving. I picked up summer school teaching. I tutored on weekends, sometimes 3 or 4 sessions crammed into a single Saturday, driving across town between appointments with Theo strapped into a car seat because I couldn't always find a sitter. I sold nearly everything I owned that wasn't load-bearing to the household. My car, actually, replaced with an older one that ran but rattled, because the trade-in value covered nearly 4 months of the down payment fund by itself. I stopped buying anything for myself that wasn't strictly necessary for almost 2 full years. No haircuts beyond what I could manage myself with a pair of scissors and a video tutorial. No new clothes. Nothing that wasn't food, rent, or something one of the kids needed for school. It took me 3 years to scrape together a down payment, and even then I only qualified for the mortgage because my credit was spotless, and I had, at that point, a stable job with 10 years of tenure ahead of it. The loan officer actually commented on it during the application process. She said it was unusual to see someone my age with 3 dependents and no co-signer, no spousal income, nothing but a single salary and a spotless payment history, managing to qualify on her own. I remember not knowing quite how to respond to that, because it didn't feel unusual to me. It felt like the only option I'd ever had. The house I bought is a modest 3-bedroom on Larkspur Street. Nothing extravagant. But it has a yard where Theo learned to ride a bike, a kitchen table where Mason did algebra homework until 11 at night some weeks, a room that Ava painted a color she called sunrise pink the summer she turned 12. There's a chip in the kitchen counter from the time Mason tried to teach himself to juggle apples at 14. There's a height chart penciled directly onto the doorframe of the hallway closet, 3 overlapping sets of marks climbing upward over a decade, because I never got around to buying one of those decorative growth chart rulers, and eventually just started marking the wall like my own mother used to do. There's a slightly uneven patch of grass in the backyard, where we buried a goldfish that didn't survive its first week, complete with a small painted rock that Theo insisted on placing there himself. None of that shows up on a property appraisal. None of that is the kind of thing a courtroom can weigh or divide. But it's what actually makes the house what it is, far more than the deed or the mortgage documents ever could. Renee's name is not on the deed. It has never been on the deed. She did not contribute $1 to the down payment, the mortgage, the renovations, the property taxes, or a single utility bill across 12 years. I have every bank statement, every mortgage document, every receipt to prove it, and I mention that now because it matters enormously to what she claimed in court. This house is not an inheritance. It's not a family property. It's the physical result of a decade of overtime, sacrifice, and a woman who did not show up choosing, from a distance, to let someone else pay for everything her children needed. I'm not going to pretend those 12 years were only hardship, because that wouldn't be honest either. There was a lot of good in there too, and I think it's important to say that, because the hardest parts of raising these kids were never really about the kids. They were wonderful. Difficult sometimes, the way all children are difficult sometimes, but wonderful. Mason turned into the kind of teenager who fixed things around the house without being asked, who got a scholarship to study engineering, who still, at 19, calls me every Sunday even from 3 states away at college. I remember the night he got his acceptance letter, how he ran into the kitchen holding his laptop, and how the first thing he said wasn't, "I got in." It was, "We did it." Not, "I did it." We. I think about that phrasing more than I probably should. 12 years, and somewhere along the way, whatever happened to him also happened to me, and he knew it without either of us saying so directly. Ava is 17 now, sharp as anything, president of her school's debate club, and she has this habit of hugging me at random moments, no reason given, like she's still making sure I'm real. She had a rough stretch around age 11 and 12, nightmares that came back worse than they'd been as a toddler, a period of anger she mostly directed at herself rather than anyone else. She'd apologize constantly for things that needed no apology, in a way that reminded me uncomfortably of the way Renee used to apologize to Danny for spilled juice and fussy babies. I remember the exact night I decided we needed outside help. Ava was 11, and she'd broken down crying over a math worksheet, not because the math was hard, but because, she told me through tears, she was scared that if she wasn't good enough, useful enough, easy enough, I might leave the way her mother had. That sentence broke something open in me that I hadn't expected. I'd spent years reassuring these kids in 100 small ways that I wasn't going anywhere. And somehow, underneath all of it, an 11-year-old had still absorbed a quiet, private fear that love was conditional on performance. We found a therapist within the week. We got her into therapy, and it helped enormously, though it took nearly 2 years of weekly sessions before she stopped apologizing for taking up space in the car on the drive home. I sat in that waiting room more times than I could count, flipping through outdated magazines, listening to the muffled rhythm of voices through a closed door, and every single time, some part of me wondered whether Renee had any idea what her daughter was working through on the other side of that door, 4 states and 1 broken marriage away. By 13, Ava had mostly worked through the worst of it. By 15, she'd become the fierce, outspoken young woman who stood up in a courtroom 2 years later and told a judge, without a single apology in her voice, exactly what she needed and deserved. Theo is 13 and doesn't remember his mother leaving at all. To him, I am simply his mother. He calls me Mom. He has never once called me Aunt Claire, not because I told him to call me that, but because it's simply what happened naturally, the way language settles into truth over enough years. I remember the exact day he started saying it. He was maybe 4, standing in the driveway waiting for me to get home from a parent-teacher conference, and he ran up yelling, "Mom!" the way kids do, without ceremony, without deciding anything. I stood there for a second, keys still in my hand, and then I picked him up and didn't correct him. I've never corrected him since. That's the part I don't think Renee understood when she decided to come back. These weren't 3 placeholder children waiting patiently in stasis for their real mother to return and pick up where she left off. 12 years happened to them. 12 years of me showing up to every single day, ordinary and extraordinary alike, while she was somewhere else building an entirely different life. Because that's what she was doing. I found out later, piece by piece, that Renee had remarried, a man named Curtis, reasonably well off, no children of his own, and that she'd spent the last several years living comfortably in another state, an entire life with no visible trace of the 3 children she'd left on my porch that Tuesday morning. Until Curtis divorced her 18 months ago. Until her comfortable life ended. Until, apparently, she needed somewhere to land. I want to fill in this part carefully, because I only learned most of it during the discovery process for our own case, and I think it explains a great deal about the timing of everything that followed. Renee met Curtis about 3 years after she left the kids with me. at a point when Danny had finally, formally, filed for divorce from her in absentia, having by then moved on with someone else entirely and shown even less interest in his children than Renee had. Curtis owned a mid-sized commercial real estate firm and had, from what I could piece together, no idea for the first year of their relationship that Renee had 3 living children at all. She'd apparently told him she'd never wanted kids, a detail that struck me hard when I first read it in the case documents, given that she had 3 of them, all still alive, all still very much needing a mother, 4 states away. By the time Curtis found out the truth, a discovery that, according to the divorce filing, happened almost accidentally, through an old mutual friend who mentioned Renee's children in passing at a dinner party. They'd already been married for nearly 4 years. Curtis's own divorce filing describes this discovery as a significant factor in the breakdown of trust in their marriage, alongside other unrelated issues. Whatever the full truth of that relationship, it ended 18 months before Renee first called me. And the settlement Renee received from that divorce was, by the numbers in the filing, considerably less generous than she may have expected, given what the filing characterizes as misrepresentations material to the union. I don't say any of this to pile on. I say it because it explains something important about the timeline. Renee's sudden interest in reconnecting with 3 children she'd shown no interest in for the better part of a decade began almost exactly when her financial safety net disappeared. I don't think that's a coincidence, and neither ultimately did the judge. She called me on a Sunday afternoon out of nowhere, after 4 years of silence, and her voice sounded exactly the way it had the day she dropped the kids off. That same particular blend of urgency and self-pity that I'd learned over a decade to recognize as the sound of Renee needing something. She said she wanted to reconnect. She said she'd made mistakes and she was ready to be a mother again. She asked to see the kids. Her tone on that call was warm, almost rehearsed, the kind of warmth that sounds practiced rather than felt. Though I told myself at the time I was probably being unfair, reading old resentments into a genuine attempt at repair. I want to be transparent about something here, because I think it matters. I didn't refuse her. Whatever she'd done, whatever 12 years of absence meant, I still believe, that these were her children biologically, and that if she genuinely wanted to rebuild something with them, that was worth trying, carefully, on the children's terms and timeline, not hers. So I told the kids she'd called. I remember gathering all 3 of them in the living room on a Sunday evening, feeling strangely nervous, like I was about to deliver news I couldn't predict the reaction to. Mason, at 19, took it the way he takes most things, quietly, processing before responding. He asked me one question: does she want something, or does she want us? I told him I honestly didn't know, and that maybe the honest answer was that even she might not know the difference anymore. He agreed to one phone call, brief, on his own terms, and made clear afterward that he wasn't interested in more than that for now. The call itself, from what he told me later, consisted mostly of Renee talking about her own difficult years, with only a few questions asked about his life in return. Ava, 17, was angrier than I expected, and told her mother exactly that on the phone. I wasn't in the room for that call, but I heard Ava's side of it from the hallway, and I heard her say, clearly and steadily, "You don't get to call this reconnecting. You get to call it starting over, if I ever decide to let you, but not on your timeline." Renee did not take that well. Ava told me afterward that her mother had cried and accused her of being turned against her, which Ava found almost funny, in a bitter way, as if 12 years of absence needed anyone's help turning a daughter against you. Theo, 13, barely remembered her and didn't particularly want to start. He asked me, with the blunt honesty only a 13-year-old can manage, "Do I have to talk to her? I don't really know her." I told him no, he didn't have to do anything he wasn't ready for, and that seemed to settle the matter for him entirely. He went back to his video game without another word on the subject. Renee did not respond to any of this with patience. Within 3 weeks of that first phone call, her tone had shifted entirely. She stopped talking about reconnecting and started talking about her rights. She said things like, "I am still their mother, legally and biologically, and I have been kept from them," conveniently omitting the 12 years in which nobody had kept her from anything except her own choice to leave. And then, 2 months after that first phone call, I received a letter from a lawyer. I remember the exact moment I opened it, standing at my own kitchen counter, mail in one hand, coffee going cold in the other, Theo doing homework at the table behind me. I read the first paragraph twice before the words actually registered, because my brain simply refused, for a few seconds, to process that my sister was suing me. Not asking, not negotiating, suing. Renee wasn't asking for visitation anymore. She was suing me for custody and for what her filing called an equitable share of the house, on the theory that the home had been purchased and maintained using resources that were, in her words, generated in part through her children's presence and contribution to the household, and that she, as their legal mother, retained an interest in property acquired during the period she was unable, due to circumstance, to provide for them directly. I had to sit down on the kitchen floor after reading that. Not dramatically. I just needed to be lower to the ground for a minute, needed something solid under me while I processed the particular cruelty of that sentence. Her children's presence and contribution to the household, as though Mason, Ava, and Theo were line items on a balance sheet rather than three people I had fed, clothed, comforted, and shown up for every single day for 12 consecutive years, entirely without her. I read that sentence 4 times before I understood what she was actually saying. She was arguing that because her children lived in my house, she had a claim to it. She was suing me for the house I built raising the kids she left behind. I'm not going to pretend I wasn't afraid. Family court is unpredictable, and lawyers can make almost anything sound plausible if they say it with enough confidence. But I also wasn't going into that courtroom with a story. I was going in with 12 years of paper. I interviewed 3 attorneys before I found the right one. The first spent most of our consultation talking about how messy family cases like this tend to get, and seemed more interested in warning me about cost than actually strategizing. The second was competent, but clearly saw the case as a straightforward custody matter, and didn't seem to grasp, at first, how significant the property claim actually was until I walked him through the specifics. The third was Patricia. My attorney, a sharp, no-nonsense woman named Patricia Alvarez, who specialized in guardianship and family property disputes, told me something early on that I've held on to since. Judges don't rule on who feels more sympathetic. They rule on what's documented. So we documented everything. She asked me, in our very first meeting, to bring every piece of paper I had from the last 12 years, no matter how small or irrelevant it seemed. Old report cards, pediatrician bills, even grocery receipts from certain weeks if I still had them. "We're not building a story," she told me. "We're building a record. Stories can be argued with. Records can't." The mortgage was in my name alone, originated 4 years after Renee left, funded entirely by a down payment traceable to my own savings and tutoring income, statements I still had, going back a decade. The guardianship order, signed voluntarily by Renee with no objection, no appeal, no attempt to reverse it in 12 years. School enrollment forms listing me as sole guardian and emergency contact for every single year for all 3 children. Medical records showing me as the consenting parent for every appointment, every vaccination, every emergency room visit, including the strawberry allergy scare, including Mason's stitches, including 4 years of Ava's therapy after the nightmares got bad enough to need it. We pulled bank records showing 0 financial contribution from Renee across 12 years. Not one support payment, not one deposit, not one gift card at Christmas. We pulled her own social media, which she hadn't thought to make private, showing years of vacations with Curtis, a wedding announcement, posts about starting fresh, that never once mentioned 3 children living 4 states away. There was a photo from a beach trip to Turks and Caicos, dated the same month as Theo's kindergarten graduation. There was a post celebrating her 2nd wedding anniversary with Curtis, captioned, "Grateful for this fresh start," posted the same week Ava had her tonsils removed, and I sat in a hospital recovery room alone at 11 at night, waiting for her to wake up from anesthesia. I'm not proud of how much time I spent scrolling through those old posts once Patricia flagged them for the case file. There's a particular kind of pain in seeing, laid out chronologically, exactly what someone chose over you and your children, dated and time-stamped and filtered for an audience of strangers. But it was useful, clinically useful, because it built an unbroken timeline of a woman living an entirely unencumbered life during the exact years she now claimed circumstances had kept her from her children. Patricia found something else too, something Renee's lawyer clearly hadn't anticipated us finding. A deposition from Renee's divorce from Curtis, filed 18 months earlier, in which, under oath, in an entirely different case, Renee had stated she had no dependents and no ongoing financial obligations to children. She'd said that under oath to secure a more favorable divorce settlement from Curtis. And now, in my case, she was claiming under oath that she'd never truly relinquished her maternal role. You cannot have it both ways in front of two different judges and expect nobody to notice. There's a part of this process I haven't talked about yet, and it might be the part I found hardest. Harder even than the hearing itself. Preparing Mason, Ava, and Theo for what was coming. Because the custody portion of Renee's filing meant that, depending on the judge's approach, the children's own preferences might be considered directly, and that meant sitting each of them down separately and explaining, in terms appropriate to their age, what was happening and what might be asked of them. I remember dreading those conversations more than anything else in the entire case, because I never wanted my kids to feel like pawns in an adult dispute, and I was terrified that no matter how carefully I explained it, that's exactly how it would land. Mason, at 19, handled it the way he handles most difficult things, with a kind of steady, slightly weary maturity that I sometimes forget he shouldn't have needed to develop this young. He said simply, "I already told her how I feel. If the judge wants to hear it too, that's fine. It doesn't change what's true." He came home from college for 2 days, specifically to be present for the hearing, even though his own testimony wasn't strictly required given his age, because he said he wanted to be in the room. Ava's conversation was harder. She's 17, old enough to have real opinions, and young enough that the legal process still felt frightening and abstract to her in a way it didn't to Mason. She asked me, at one point, whether she'd be forced to live with Renee if the judge decided that way, and I had to be honest that I didn't know for certain, though everything about the case, her age, her clearly stated preference, the court evaluator's likely recommendation, made that outcome extremely unlikely. She cried that night, not from fear exactly, but from the strange, disorienting anger of realizing that a woman who'd been absent for most of her life still had the legal standing to potentially upend it. Theo's situation was different again. At 13, the court appointed an independent evaluator, a child psychologist named Dr. Reyes, to meet with him privately and assess, without any parent in the room, what living situations served his best interests. I wasn't in that meeting, obviously, and I spent the entire hour it lasted pacing outside a small office building, terrified in a way I hadn't expected to be, terrified that somehow, in some way I couldn't predict, the process itself might unsettle a child who had never known any instability at all. Dr. Reyes's report, when it came back, described Theo as securely attached to his primary caregiver, and noted that he expressed no meaningful relationship or attachment to his biological mother, whom he referred to, in his own words during the evaluation, as the lady who used to call sometimes. That phrase, the lady who used to call sometimes, appeared directly in the evaluator's written report, and I think it did more to settle the custody question than any argument Patricia could have made in court. The hearing took place over 2 days in a courtroom that felt too small and too bright for what was actually happening inside it. I sat in that room and watched my sister, dressed carefully, sitting up straight, tell a judge that she had never intended to permanently give up her children, that circumstances beyond her control had kept her away, and that I had, in her words again, used her children's need for stability as leverage to build wealth she was never entitled to. At one point, her lawyer asked her directly why, if she'd always intended to return, she had gone 4 consecutive years without a single phone call, card, or message to any of the 3 children. Renee paused for a long moment before answering. She said she had been in a dark place and didn't want to disrupt their stability by coming in and out of their lives inconsistently. I watched Ava's jaw tighten in the row behind me when she heard that. Consistency was exactly what Renee hadn't provided, and now she was using its absence as an excuse for the absence itself. Her lawyer argued that the house represented value accumulated during a period when Renee's children lived there, and that basic principles of equity entitled her to some portion of it, regardless of whose name was on the deed. Patricia didn't raise her voice once. She simply laid out the paper trail, document by document. The guardianship order Renee signed without protest. The mortgage in my name alone, 4 years after Renee left, funded by income Renee had no part in earning. 12 years of medical and school records with my signature, and no attempt from Renee to contest or amend that arrangement. And then, carefully, almost gently, Patricia introduced the deposition from Renee's divorce from Curtis. The sworn statement that she had no dependents, no financial ties to children, filed 18 months prior. I watched the judge's expression shift when that document went up. Not anger. Something quieter and more damning. The recognition of someone who has just watched a story fall apart in real time. The judge asked Renee directly to explain the contradiction between her sworn statement in the Curtis divorce and her current claim. Renee's answer was that she didn't think it was relevant at the time. The judge did not appear to find that explanation persuasive and asked a follow-up question that I still think about. Ms. Whitfield, is it your testimony that a legal declaration of no dependents, made under oath 18 months ago, was simply inaccurate? Or was it convenient? Renee didn't have a clean answer for that. She said something about being confused about the legal terminology at the time, which strained credibility given that she had, by her own admission on the stand, reviewed the document with her divorce attorney before signing it. Her lawyer tried to recover, arguing that regardless of the prior statement, the core question before the court was one of equity. Whether a home built partially during a period when her biological children resided there created some obligation regardless of her absence. Patricia's response to that argument was, I thought, the sharpest moment of the entire hearing. She stood and said, simply, that equity requires contribution, and that the record showed 12 years of one party contributing everything, labor, money, presence, care, and the other party contributing a signature on a guardianship form and nothing else. You cannot, she said, claim equity in a house you never helped build, using children you chose not to raise, against a woman who did both alone. On custody, there wasn't much of a decision to make. Mason was 19 and had already stated, on record, that he had no interest in reopening custody arrangements for himself. When the judge asked if he wanted to add anything, he stood, which nobody had instructed him to do, and said simply, My mother is a stranger who happens to share my last name. My aunt is the person who raised me. I don't think that's a hard question, but I'm glad you're the one answering it instead of me. I don't think I'd ever been prouder of him than in that exact moment, watching a 19-year-old say, with total composure, something I'd spent 12 years too afraid to say out loud myself. Ava, at 17, was permitted to state her own preference directly to the judge, and she did, clearly and without hesitation. She told him she had no desire to live with her mother, that she'd tried, twice now, to have an honest conversation with Renee, and been met both times with excuses rather than accountability, and that she considered the house on Larkspur Street the only home she'd ever really known. Her voice shook slightly toward the end, not from uncertainty, but from the effort of saying something so clearly true in a room designed to make everything feel uncertain. Theo, at 13, was assessed by a court-appointed evaluator who recommended no disruption to his current living situation, citing his complete lack of attachment to his biological mother and his stable, well-adjusted relationship with me as his primary and functionally only parent. On the house, the ruling was direct. No equitable claim existed. The property was solely mine, purchased and maintained with my own funds, with no financial or legal contribution from Renee at any point. The court noted, specifically, that a parent who voluntarily relinquishes physical and legal custody for over a decade does not retain a property interest in assets built during that absence, particularly when that same parent has, under oath in another proceeding, denied having dependents at all. The judge's written ruling included a line I've read probably 20 times since. He wrote that, "Equity is not a substitute for accountability, and a party cannot invoke the language of family obligation only when it becomes financially convenient to do so, having explicitly disavowed that same obligation when it served a different purpose." I don't think I'd ever heard a legal document say, in careful, measured language, something so close to what I'd wanted to say to my sister for 12 years. Renee's lawyer requested a brief continuance to review options for appeal. The judge granted the standard window but noted, almost as an aside, that he saw little basis in the existing record for a different outcome on appeal, given the volume and consistency of the documentary evidence. I don't know yet whether she'll actually pursue that. Patricia says these cases rarely survive appeal when the trial record is this clean, and privately, she said something else that stuck with me, that in 15 years of family law, she'd rarely seen a case where one party's own prior sworn testimony did so much of the opposing side's work for them. I want to describe the moment right after the ruling was read, because it stayed with me more vividly than almost anything else in this entire process. Mason had flown back for the final day of the hearing, and he was sitting beside Ava in the second row, with Theo, who wasn't required to attend but had insisted on coming, squeezed between them. When the judge finished reading the property ruling, there was no dramatic outburst, no gasp, nothing like what you'd see in a courtroom drama. Just a kind of quiet, settling stillness, the sound of a room absorbing a decision it had mostly already expected. Renee didn't look at me. She gathered her things quickly, said something quiet to her lawyer, and left through a side door before I'd even fully stood up from my seat. I don't know what I expected. An apology, maybe, or at least eye contact. But I got neither. And if I'm honest, I'd made my peace with that possibility well before we ever walked into that room. Outside on the courthouse steps, in the strange, flat sunlight of an ordinary Tuesday afternoon, Ava hugged me first, hard, without saying anything for a long moment. Then she said quietly, "You didn't have to do any of this. You didn't have to fight for us like this." I told her the truth, which is that there was never a version of this where I wasn't going to fight, because that's what the last 12 years had already been. One long, ordinary fight, mostly invisible, that had simply become visible for 2 days in a courtroom. Mason didn't say much. He just put his hand on my shoulder the way he does now that he's taller than me, and said, "We're good. It's over." Theo, 13 and mostly unbothered by the legal weight of the day, asked if we could get pizza on the way home, which felt somehow like exactly the right way to end it. We did. We sat in a booth at the same pizza place we'd been going to for years, and nobody mentioned the courtroom again for the rest of that night. I didn't feel triumphant when the ruling came down. I want to be honest about that because I think there's a version of this story where I'd want to tell you I stood up and felt vindicated and victorious, and that's not quite true. Mostly I felt tired and a little sad in a way I hadn't expected. Because here's what Renee actually lost, and it has nothing to do with the house. She lost 12 years she can never get back. Not through a lawsuit, not through an apology, not through anything. Mason doesn't remember her tucking him in. He remembers me doing it. Ava's first period, her first heartbreak, her college application essays. None of those happened with Renee in the room. Theo doesn't have a single memory of his mother at all, not one, and no court ruling changes that. She missed Mason's first day of middle school, when he was so nervous he threw up before breakfast, and I sat with him on the bathroom floor until he felt steady enough to get in the car. She missed his first heartbreak too, a girl named Priya in 10th grade who he thought he'd marry someday, and the 3 days he barely spoke to anyone after that ended. She missed Ava's debate tournament wins, 6 of them over 2 years, and the one loss that mattered more than any win, when Ava came off the stage in tears, and I held her in a hallway outside a school auditorium 200 miles from home. She missed every single one of Theo's soccer games, all 4 seasons of them. Missed him scoring his first goal in 5th grade and running straight to the sideline looking for someone and finding me instead of her. None of that shows up in a legal filing. None of that can be quantified as an asset or divided as property. But it's the actual ledger of what those 12 years cost her, and no ruling about a house changes a single line of it. She walked away from all 3 of them for a decade, built an entirely separate life, and only came looking for a relationship when that separate life fell apart and she needed somewhere and something to land on. And when even that didn't work out the way she wanted, she didn't come back humbled. She came back with a lawyer and a theory about entitlement to property she never once contributed to. That, more than the house, is the real loss, not the ruling. The 12 years, and what she did with them, and who she chose to be during them. I've since heard, secondhand, that Renee is telling people I poisoned the children against her, and that the court sided with money over motherhood. I don't spend much energy correcting that story anymore. The people who matter, Mason, Ava, Theo, know exactly what happened, because they lived it, every single day, for 12 years. Life on Larkspur Street looks a lot like it did before any of this happened, which I think is the quiet, unglamorous version of a happy ending. Mason still calls on Sundays. Ava is applying to colleges now, several of them, and asked me last week to help her write her personal essay, which, without either of us planning it, ended up being about what it means to have someone stay. She read me a line from her draft the other night, sitting at that same kitchen table where Mason used to do his algebra homework, and it caught me off guard enough that I had to leave the room for a minute. She'd written, "I used to think family meant the people who share your blood. I've learned it means the people who show up on the ordinary days, the ones nobody's watching." Theo made the middle school soccer team this fall. I was at every practice I could get to, the way I've been at every practice, every recital, every parent-teacher conference for 12 years, not because a court told me to, but because that's what showing up actually means. He scored his first goal of the season 2 weeks ago, and I have video of it on my phone that I've probably watched a dozen times since. Him turning immediately toward the sideline, scanning the crowd, and grinning the moment he found me. The house itself is unchanged by any of this, at least on the surface. Same kitchen table, same yard, same room Ava painted sunrise pink at 12. But I notice now how much weight that ordinary stability actually carries, having spent months hearing it described in a courtroom as a disputed asset rather than simply a home. I catch myself sometimes standing in the doorway of Theo's room after he's asleep, looking at the space, thinking about the version of events where a judge might have seen it differently, and feeling something like relief mixed with a low, persistent anger that it ever came to needing defended at all. Renee reached out once more after the ruling, a short message saying she hoped we could move past this eventually. I haven't responded yet. I might someday. I don't hold hatred for her. Hatred takes energy I'd rather spend on 3 kids who deserve every bit of it. But I'm not interested in pretending the last 12 years, or the lawsuit that followed them, didn't happen. I've told the kids, individually, that the door isn't permanently closed on their end, that whatever relationship they choose to have with their mother going forward is entirely theirs to decide, on their own terms and timeline, the same way it's always been. None of them have expressed much interest in reopening it yet. That may change. It may not. I've made my peace with either outcome because it was never my decision to make for them in the first place. If there's a lesson in any of this, I think it's this. Showing up is not a small thing. It's not a placeholder for something more important that happens later. Showing up every single ordinary day for 12 years when nobody is watching and nobody is applauding, that is the whole thing. That is parenthood, not biology, not a name on a birth certificate. The years, actually lived, actually spent. You don't get to leave for a decade and then sue the person who stayed for the roof they built over the children you left behind. Whatever you call that in a legal filing, it isn't motherhood. It's an invoice for a debt you never earned the right to collect. I think about that Tuesday morning a lot. The dinosaur t-shirt, the untied shoe, the stuffed rabbit missing an ear. 1 hour, she said. I've thought more than once about what would have happened if I'd said no that day, if I'd told her I couldn't. I don't know what would have become of Mason, Ava, and Theo, and I try not to dwell too long in that particular what if, because it isn't a kind place to sit. What I know instead is what did happen. 3 children grew up safe, loved, and steady in a house that exists because someone chose, every single day for 12 years, to keep choosing them. That's not something a lawsuit can take. That's not something a judge needed to rule on, though I'm glad he did, and I'm glad the paper trail spoke for itself when it mattered. If you've ever been the one who stayed, the one who showed up while someone else disappeared, the one who built something real out of someone else's absence, I hope you hear this clearly. What you built is yours. Nobody gets to walk back in years later and claim a share of the life you built out of their absence. Some debts aren't measured in money, and some people only come looking for what you built once they've run out of everywhere else to go. I want to say one more thing directly, because I know some of you watching this are not just listening to a story, you're living some version of it right now. Maybe you're the one who got a phone call that started with just for an hour. Maybe you're already 3, 5, 8 years into raising a niece, a nephew, a grandchild, a sibling's child, because someone else walked away and you were the one who couldn't. If that's you, I want you to hear something I wish someone had told me 12 years ago. You are allowed to grieve the unfairness of it while still choosing to show up every day. Those two things are not in conflict. I spent years feeling guilty for occasionally resenting the position I'd been put in, as though loving those children fully meant I wasn't allowed to also feel the weight of what I'd lost. The years of my own 20s I didn't get to spend the way I might have. The relationships that didn't survive the sudden reality of instant parenthood. The version of my life that quietly disappeared the day that car pulled out of my driveway. You're allowed to hold both. Love and grief are not opposites. Most of the time, in situations like this, they're the same feeling wearing 2 different faces. I also want to say this, plainly, to anyone worried about a similar legal fight in their own future. Document everything, from the very beginning, even when it feels unnecessary, even when it feels like you're being paranoid or distrustful of a family member you still love. Keep the guardianship paperwork. Keep the school forms. Keep the receipts. Not because you expect betrayal, but because the version of your relative who leaves for 1 hour is not always the version who might come back years later, and you deserve to be protected either way. And finally, to anyone who has ever been made to feel, by an absent parent's return, that the stability you built somehow makes you the villain of the story, it doesn't. Showing up isn't theft. Staying isn't manipulation. Building a stable, loving home for children who needed one is not a crime you should ever have to defend in a courtroom, even if, like me, you eventually find yourself doing exactly that. And if you do end up there, know this: the truth, documented plainly and told without exaggeration, is usually enough. It was enough for me. I believe it will be enough for you too. I think, in the end, about a conversation I had with Ava a few nights after the ruling. She asked me if I was angry at her mother, and I told her honestly that anger wasn't really the word for what I felt anymore. Anger is what I felt in the early years, in the sleepless nights, in the emergency room visits, in the quiet fury of doing everything alone while someone else built a separate, unencumbered life 4 states away. What I feel now is something quieter and more settled. Not forgiveness exactly, not peace exactly either. Just the calm, grounded certainty of someone who knows, beyond any doubt, that she did right by 3 children who needed her, regardless of what it cost her, regardless of what came afterward, regardless of a lawsuit that tried and failed to rewrite 12 years of ordinary, unglamorous devotion into something it never was. That certainty is worth more to me than the house ever could be, though I'm grateful every single day that the house is still ours, too. Thank you for listening to our story. If it meant something to you, I hope you'll share it with someone else who might need to hear it today.